Hello and welcome to the first of our Discover SLM talks. I particularly want to extend a warm welcome to our members, donors and supporters. My name is Nerida Campbell and I'm currently the Head of Curatorial at Sydney Living Museums. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I live and currently work. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and future. Curators at SLM are constantly discovering new stories about the people, places and things we care for at our 12 sites. During this talk series, we will be sharing some of this research with you as we explore a range of subjects from food to the 1919 flu pandemic, from music to the historical use of colour to decorate Australian homes. So keep an eye out for future talks about your favourite subject, or for the incurably curious, tune in every Tuesday at 12 till 12:30 for a new topic. There will be time for questions at the end of each talk. Just add them to the Zoom chat. Today's speaker is curator Dr. Scott Hill, who is attached to Rouse Hill House, Elizabeth Farm and Marugal. As a teenager, Scott was captivated by pictures of ruins, trying to imagine how people had lived in these dramatic and crumbling spaces. This fascination led to his interest in historic architecture and how a house both reflected and recorded the lives of its past inhabitants. Formal studies in architecture, along with travels through Asia and Europe, furthered his interest in colonial architecture, domestic design, the intrinsic relationship between architecture and the landscape, and interpretation of the ephemeral, ever-changing lives of objects, places, and people in house museums. In 2016, he received his PhD, on John MacArthur and the long design process that led from Elizabeth Farm to the construction of Camden Park. Currently, he is researching the closely interwoven stories of people who worked at Rouse Hill and the art collections of Hannah and Bessie Rouse. Today, he'll be sharing with us the tale of the Prince of Braganza. Thanks, Scott.
Hi, everybody. And I'd also like to echo Nerida's sentiment and recognise the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation where I'm working today, and also the Darug people on whose lands this story begins out at Rouse Hill House and Farm. So I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me one moment. And here we go. So in February 1903, the Count Deniva arrived in Sydney and he rapidly made a name for himself as a crack shot with local shooting clubs. He was sophisticated and he was charming, but who exactly was he? Was he really titled, and was he really on a round-the-world cruise, as he claimed? So starting with a photograph in the front hall at Rouse Hill, a tale emerges of a European aristocrat with the very highest of connections in exile following a scandal at the coronation of Edward VII. So our story actually starts here at Rouse Hill House in northwestern Sydney, one of the properties that I'm very privileged to be able to look after. And it's a property that was built by Richard Rouse in the early 1800s. And why it's so significant is that when it was acquired by the state government in 1978, the extraordinary collections inside the house, which spanned 6.5 generations of the Rouse and Terry families who lived there, were able to be acquired as well. Here we are in the front hall, so the vestibule at Rouse Hill House, and what the two kids are looking at on the right, you can just see this photograph of a group of people very formally dressed at a very formal function. It's a hand-coloured photograph that was commissioned by Nina Terry, née Rouse, and it commemorated a function held in 1903, and it was the St Vincent's Hospital Charity Ball. And I've slightly cheated with this photograph because we also have a black and white copy of the photograph. So I've overlaid it into this newspaper article here, just because it's so much clearer. What it was of, as I was saying, was a charity ball. And at this ball, there were the various sets, as they were called. So in this case, we have the hunting set. There was also the military set, the naval set. There was a Moroccan set, for instance. So it was a fancy dress ball. This particular group, known as the hunting set, came in with the men in hunting pinks, as they were called. So the bright red, very distinctive jackets of English fox hunting. The women in long white gowns, and you can just see what they're carrying are riding crops, which are covered in a flower arrangement. Various people we know who are in this photograph. It's listed in the newspapers, but also on the back of the photograph, it's written down who all the various people are. So when we're looking at the back row, we've got Lord Richard Neville. He's the Chamberlain for the Governor General, Lord Tennyson, at that point. So it's already we're seeing that at this event, it's quite an array of society in Sydney at this period. On the far right-hand side, there's Nina Terry, née Rouse. And over towards the centre, that's her husband, George. And he'd been newly appointed as the master of the Sydney Hunt Club. And you can see just below that, there's actually one of his riding coats hanging on one of the bedroom doors at Rouse Hill House itself. So all the men in this photograph are wearing these distinctive hunting pinks. But there's somebody else in this photograph. And that's this man over here in the back row. On the back of the photograph, he's labelled as the Count Deniva, spelt like this, son of the Duke of Braganza. Now, of course, this is a very interesting title, catches your eye immediately. And I did a bit of investigating, and that's where we hit a bit of a problem, because in 1903, the man on the right, is the Duke of Braganza. Duke of Braganza, and it's a subsidiary title, Count Deniva, are royal titles attached to the then Portuguese royal house. On the left, you have then King Carlos I, and on the right, his son Louis Philippe, the Prince Royal, who, as was customary, had the title Duke of Braganza, and also that subsidiary title of the Count Deniva. So Louis Philippe, unfortunately, in 1903, is only 16. So it's obviously not him. So who is this person claiming to be the Count Deniva in Sydney? And this is the answer, is that there is another Duke of Braganza. If we go back to 1834, you have, oops, sorry about that. Technical issues. Miguel I of Portugal had seized the throne. He was appointed regent for his niece, and he had actually seized the throne. It led to a civil war, and then in 1834, he was actually deposed and removed, was banished along with his descendants from Portugal upon pain of death. He goes across various European states before settling in Vienna, where he actually has ancestral links in the court at Vienna. His son then, Miguel II, also claims the title Duke of Braganza, and Miguel is living also in Vienna at the Austrian court. He's referred to as the Miguelist pretender, and he marries the Princess Elizabeth of Thermal-Taxis. They have two sons, known as the Princes of Braganza. Miguel on the left, the elder brother, and then his younger brother, Francis Joseph. And I do need to have a little quick diversion into some names, because in Portuguese, of course, he has a substantially longer title. There you can see it. In English, we refer to him as Francis Joseph, the Prince of Braganza. In Austrian, however, he's the Prince and Franz Joseph. And you variously see him referred to in documents such as newspapers as the Count F. Deniva, Neva, Neve, the Con Deniva, the Comte Deniva, the Comte F. Deniva. So various spellings appear in the various newspapers at this period. So I'll be referring to him mostly as Franz Joseph, which is the name he was referred to by in Austria. But if I say Francis Joseph, you'll know who I mean. Here he is on the right-hand side in his uniform in the Austrian Hussars, so that sort of elite military unit. And you can see he's got this very distinctive face, that high brow, the arched eyebrows, that slightly languorous look, very, very distinctive. And on the left, there he is with his father, his brother, and his sister by his father's first marriage. Now, if we jump to 1902, and the story really starts to get complicated. King Edward VII is due to be crowned on June the 26th, and from all over Europe, you've got members of the aristocratic royal families flocking to the British capital for this great event. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who is the heir to the throne of Austria and Hungary, is sent to head the Austrian delegation, and accompanying him in the retinue are the Braganza princes, so Miguel and his brother Francis Joseph. There's a problem though, because Edward comes down with peritonitis. He's gravely ill. It's quite possible he would actually die. And in fact, the operation that saves his life is a new procedure that's being tried out. So the coronation is postponed and eventually takes place on August the 9th. This means that you've got a huge number of European aristocrats basically kicking their heels in London, waiting for the new coronation. The date, and this is where Franz Joseph comes unstuck. Because on the 2nd of July in 1902, he's arraigned before the Suffolk court, and he's been charged with gross indecency under what's referred to as Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. This was a law which the Amendment Act originally come in many ways to protect women from being forced, for instance, into prostitution. But at the very last minute, this subsection called Section 11 is brought in and introduced as well. And it is especially targeting gay men. The case is first discussed in the various papers, and the identity of the prince is at first being covered. This is one from Dundee in Scotland. It says, the charge against all the prisoners is understood to be one of a repulsive and unreportable character and to have arisen in a squalid neighbourhood of Stamford Street. Not placed in the dock, but allowed to stand beside it, was a faultlessly dressed young gentleman of 22, clean-shaven, dark of complexion and with fair hair. Nothing was said to identify him, but he is credibly reported to be a prince of a royal house and a lieutenant of the Austrian army, in attendance upon a royal personage who was last week in London as a representative of a European court. When the Section 11 was actually first introduced, the instant criticism that was made of it was that it was going to lead to blackmail. And this is exactly what happened. And it was often referred to as the Blackmailers Act. And one of the things that you see, especially in the 1890s, are gangs of what are referred to as blackmail boys. These were groups of young men, teenagers, men in their 20s, who would target men on the street, approach them and blackmail and say, you either pay up or we're going to make a large fuss and claim that you propositioned us for sex. Most of the times, it's the sheer terror of this meant that the victims paid up instantly. The most well-known of the people to come undone with this act is, of course, Oscar Wilde. And in one of his plays, An Ideal Husband of 1895, there's actually a line that talks about the repercussions of this act and what's happening in London society. And one of the characters says, nowadays, with our modern mania for morality, everyone has to pose as a paragon of purity, incorruptibility, and all the other 7 deadly virtues. And what is the result? Not a year passes in England without somebody disappearing. Scandals used to lend charm or at least interest to a man, and now they crush him. And yours is a very nasty scandal. You couldn't survive it, and you would be hounded out of public life, and you would disappear completely. And what's quite important here as well is that because this is a new age of international journalism, is that Franz Joseph's case gets reported almost immediately right around the world. And here's an actual section of a report published in Sydney in a newspaper called the Sydney Sportsman. I want you to remember that name because it's going to pop up again later. And it's interesting the way it starts off. There's another stinking affair of the Oscar Wilde, Lord Douglas type in London. This time a blinky prince is the main guy, Prince Francis Joseph of Braganza. Betcha the precious prince would get all the consideration there was going. He'd kids to be going to bring charges of conspiracy to rob and blackmail against the three Gerties. Just a page from the records of the Old Bailey, because the prince is found innocent. And the reason is that the evidence found against him is just found to be just too inconsistent. It gets quite comical in parts. What's happened is that the prince is approached by three men on the street. He's taken back with them to a lodging house. The landlord becomes suspicious of events and in his court deposition says he drills a hole through the bedroom door to observe what is going on. And there he sees these acts underway. What comes out in the case, though, is that through said hole in the door, all you could see was the foot of the bed. So, of course, the evidence against him collapses. The three other men involved confess then that what they were trying to do was to blackmail the prince. So the whole thing was a setup. And they are then charged, found guilty and sentenced to hard labour. The prince is let off. But there are consequences, because the prince has to return home to Vienna. And at this point, enter stage right, the Emperor of Austria and Hungary, Franz Joseph I. The Emperor is no less than the godfather of our prince. And you'll notice that they have the same name, Francis Joseph, Franz Joseph. He's also connected by marriage. The Emperor's wife was actually a relative of the Braganza line. So, in very scandal-averse, the court of Vienna is very scandal-averse. The emperor is extremely morally upright, and he immediately demands that Franz Joseph resign his position in the Hussars, which he does. And then he's placed under what is referred to as a curator. And there's a very sort of contemporary example of this underway, which is Britney Spears over in America being placed under, as it's termed over there, a conservatorship, where all of his legal rights are stripped away and he's effectively becoming a minor. And all of his legal rights are transferred to his brother-in-law, the Prince of Braganza. And in the report in the Austrian newspaper, part of it translates as is well known, Prince Franz Joseph von Braganza was embroiled in a very embarrassing indictment several months ago in London, where he went on the occasion of the coronation of King Edward. Prince Franz Joseph von Braganza is the second son of Duke Miguel Braganza, the Princess of Maria Therese. So again, you have all these extraordinary connections to the Austrian court. So we've now got a position where our prince has escaped prosecution, but he's facing total social disgrace back in Vienna. So what's a prince to do in a situation like this? First of all, we get a change of name, because for the next stage of his life, he's not referred to as the Prince of Braganza, which, remember, is a name that's and a title that's been broadcast right around the world. He now goes by his father's secondary title, the Count Deniva, and he travels under this name. He leaves Bremen in the seaport of northern Germany in late 1902, and he arrives in Sydney on February the 19th. Almost immediately, he lands on his feet. Remember, he's a hussar, so he's an absolute crack shot. He joins the Sydney Gun Club, and only 4 days after arriving, he wins their Monte Carlo trophy. He then goes on to win the President's Trophy and then the state championship, and he's bringing in all the prize money. So this looks like the way he's actually supporting himself economically while he's here. And this little quote is quite important. The Count F. Deniva was decorated with the blue ribbon of the pigeon shooting arena of the state. There is a dreadful carnage in pigeons over these few months. It was a most popular win, and the victor came in for well-merited applause. But do you notice which newspaper this is published in? It's the Sydney Sportsman, again, the one that railed against the prince when the case first went to court. So it would seem that people are not exactly aware of who he is, and so his ruse of travelling under the title Count de Neve has worked. Over the next 6 months, he engages in a whole series of shooting challenges for very high wages. We're looking at like £50, £100 or even more per contest. He's winning most of these. So this really is looking like how he's financially supporting himself while he's here. However, when we jump to in September, and suddenly the Count leaves. And it's in this report here that we really get an idea about the kind of impact he's had on Sydney society. No doubt it will come as a surprise to many to learn that Count F. de Neve bade New South Wales au revoir last Saturday when he set sail for his native city, Vienna, Austria. He did not anticipate leaving at such an early date, but a communication from home by cable made it almost compulsory. Very few distinguished visitors have made themselves so popular in social or sporting circles as the Count. So it looks like his previous history has been completely not recognised. He was always the same, genial, jovial, and affable to a fault. As a pigeon shot, he's left his mark behind, and his win of the championship of the state before he left came at an appropriate time. The Count takes with him the best wishes of all with whom he came into contact, and from myself, I wish him bon voyage. Why did he leave in such a hurry? What was this mystery cable? This is something we don't know, but there is one other contact here in Sydney. And that's this man. If you remember back to the original photograph where this whole story starts, there's the prince in the back row with that very distinctive high forehead, the arched eyebrows, that languorous look again. But notice the man in front of him, who is also pretty much the only person in this photograph who looks like he's having a good time. He's the only one actually smiling. His name is Johan Ludwig, the Baron von Hoeninger-Carroll. Interesting name because he does have Irish ancestry as well. He was the newly appointed Consul General for Austria-Hungary, and he had arrived in Sydney less than a week after Francis Joseph back in February. And I do have to wonder, when Francis Joseph got here, did he get quite a surprise when less than a week later, someone who knew him very well from the Austrian court pops up on the other side of the planet? This comes down to this idea of why was he here in the first place? Was he just laying low? Was it with the agreeance of his father? These are things that we just don't know, but we can surmise. And we're back to the original photograph. So that's the story of the Prince of Braganza as revealed by his single presence in a photograph and the annotation on the back of a photograph. Just one of these really sort of chance little jottings from history that uncovers an entire story. If people have any questions, I'd be more than happy now to answer them.
Thanks, Scott. We do have some questions coming through the chat. The first is, what happened to the prince after he left Australia?
Oh, it's not a great tale, unfortunately. What's quite interesting is that he pops up in the media again very quickly. And in fact, only 1 year later, there's a record of visiting sportsmen from Sydney who are traveling Europe and bump into him again and go and visit him in Austria. So he's still on the the colonial radar, if you will. But events start to he then pops up in newspapers over the next couple of years, like in Monte Carlo as well, for instance, again at pigeon shooting. It seems to be quite his forte. And he appears in sporting matches throughout Southern Europe. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to work out whether it is actually him or whether it might be his brother. His brother goes by the title of Duke de Visu. So Count de Neve seems to be being used by him very much as a courtesy title. So he's popping up for a couple of years' time. Everything goes horribly wrong, though, in 1908, because on the 1st of February, the king and the crown prince of Portugal are both assassinated. And this leads to then an anti-monarchist uprising in Portugal, which Francis Joseph then goes and joins on the monarchist side as one of the leading figures of that. A couple of years after that as well, Franz Ferdinand, who he accompanied to London, is assassinated, and this starts World War I. He re-enlists and fights on the Austrian side, but he's captured. And in 19, he actually dies of heart failure as a prisoner of war in an Italian prison. So he doesn't have a great and illustrious life stretching on after him. Quite a shame.
And Scott, Suzanne would like to know, did the local gentry have any idea of his scandalous background?
That's a really good question. Some people must have known because people have connections. I think on the whole, the vast bulk of people didn't. Certainly the Austro-Hungarian embassy, they knew exactly who he was. When I look at the annotation on the back of the photograph, it was actually produced many, many years later. And I suspect that Nina and George didn't know who he was at that time, because like that, the sportsman that I mentioned who was traveling through Europe, when you read his account published in 1904 of his travels, he actually says, I went to Siebenstein, where there's the estate of the Count de Neve's father. And then he says the Count de Neve's father proper title is the Prince of Braganza. So the first time you actually start to see these being mentioned is about a year later. So yeah, I'd say a couple of people knew, and they were keeping discreetly quiet because they certainly would have known of the scandal. But I think on the whole, no, I don't think the bulk of people knew.
And Alicia would like to know, are the women in the photo wearing wigs or is their hair powdered? There's one point.
Both is the answer. Yes, they're all wearing quite high wigs, and don't they all look like they're enjoying themselves? It's a very formal photograph. Yes, they're all wearing wigs, tall wigs. There's a fashion about this period in very formal events like these for the women to wear these tall white silvery wigs, which are powdered. It pops up quite a few times in like vice-regal balls and things like that. So yes, they're all wearing wigs. One of the other sets at the ball was called the Duchess of Devonshire's set. So this is Georgiana back in the Georgian period. And in that one as well, the women were all wearing very high powdered wigs. So yep, they're all wearing wigs.
And we've got time for one last question. A few people have wanted to know, were there others who went to Australia to avoid scandal?
Oh, yes. And in fact, one of the really interesting ones is a young man named Maurice Schwab. He was an intimate of Oscar Wilde and Bosie Douglas. And he's quite well connected as well politically in London. Either he is sent out here by his relatives or he comes out here to New Zealand and also to Sydney while the heat is dying down during Oscar Wilde's trial. So he's here. One of the most famous would have to be William Lygon, Earl Beauchamp, who was also the governor here in the very, very early 1900s, just before this period. So he's not here when the Prince is in Sydney. He returns to Sydney afterwards, though, very much in exile to escape the heat, because he has been outed to the king by his brother-in-law, the Duke of Westminster. And while that situation is at fever pitch, he leaves the country. He's better known to history and to literature as Earl Marchmain in Brideshead Revisited. So they're two of certainly some of the most well-known figures who come to the other side of the world. It's certainly a trope in British literature, the idea of like the disgraced younger son being sent out to the colonies all around the world, for instance, while the heat dies down. So yes, there are many other people who leave to escape the heat and to avoid scandal. But as we've seen with the Prince, with the new age of journalism, scandal can follow you. It's not something you could do now, for instance, because with the internet, scandal follows you within seconds.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was really a fantastic talk. To the audience, if you'd like to join us next week, we're going to be exploring the archaeology of Hyde Park Barracks, or you can join us on Thursday to hear something about History Reflected exhibition, some more curated talks about that. Thanks for joining us.